There is a moment, late at night, when you replay something you said hours ago. A comment in a meeting, a joke that didn't land, a message you sent that took 4 minutes to write and has now sat there, unanswered, for 3 hours. You turn it over. You edit it in your mind. You imagine the face of the person who heard it. Did they think you were strange? Too much? Not enough? You have done this 1,000 times. You will do it again tonight. And somewhere underneath the replaying, there's a quieter, more exhausting question, one you rarely say out loud even to yourself. When does this end? Not the specific worry. That one will resolve itself, the way they always do, forgotten by the very people you imagined were still thinking about it. The real question is about the whole architecture, the constant, low-grade monitoring of how you're being perceived, the way you soften your opinions before you've even finished forming them, the way you feel a flicker of dread before walking into a room, checking, always checking, whether you are being received well. You have wondered, in your more honest moments, if there is a version of you that doesn't do this. A version who says the true thing without pre-editing it for safety, who walks into the room without first calculating the room's opinion of her, who lets silence sit instead of filling it with an apology no one asked for. You've seen people like this. Not arrogant people, that's a different, uglier thing. Just, unclenched, free of the flinch. You've assumed this freedom was either a personality trait you weren't born with, or a privilege you haven't earned, or a coldness you don't actually want. Here is the thing almost no one tells you. It isn't any of those. It's a stage, a specific, nameable stage in a process most people never complete, because they mistake the discomfort of getting there for a sign they're doing something wrong. You are not broken for still caring this much. You are simply not finished yet. And the very fact that this exhausts you, that the monitoring feels heavy instead of natural, means you're closer to the end of it than you think. The man who understood this stage better than almost anyone wrote it into nearly every major character he created. Fyodor Dostoevsky. He knew what it was to be watched, judged, and found wanting, not abstractly, but literally. He stood before a firing squad as a young man, convicted for revolutionary reading circles, and was pulled back from execution at the last possible moment, a mock execution staged by the state as psychological punishment. He lived years afterward in Siberian exile. He accumulated crushing gambling debts. He wrote some of his greatest novels racing against creditors and deadlines, terrified of what people would think of him if he failed. And yet the deepest insight running through his fiction is this: the people most enslaved to others' opinions are usually the ones most disconnected from their own inner truth. Freedom, for Dostoevsky, was never about not caring. It was about no longer needing the world's verdict to know who you are. That distinction is the entire subject of tonight's video. Here's what we're going to walk through. 5 stages that lead a person from compulsive people pleasing to something Dostoevsky would recognize as real dignity. Not numbness, not arrogance, something else entirely, something harder won and quieter. We'll trace how the need for approval forms, how it hardens into a kind of self-erasure, how it eventually breaks, often in a moment that feels like collapse rather than victory, and what waits for you on the other side of that collapse. There's a specific moment near the end of this process, a very particular internal shift that most people never even hear described. It's not indifference. It's not confidence, exactly. It has a strange, specific texture, and once you know what it feels like, you'll recognize it the instant it starts happening to you. Stay until the end for that. It changes how you'll read everything that comes before it. One more thing before we begin. This isn't a video about becoming someone who no longer cares about other people. That would be a smaller, colder thing than what we're actually after. This is about something closer to what Dostoevsky spent his entire writing life circling: the difference between a self built out of other people's approval and a self that can finally stand on its own ground, and only from that ground, Choose connection freely instead of needing it to survive. Chapter 1. The room you never left. Think back to the earliest version of this pattern in you. Not the adult sophistication of it, the raw, original shape. For most people, it starts small and blameless. A child learns, correctly, that certain behaviors bring warmth and certain behaviors bring coldness. This is not a flaw in the child. It's how every human learns to belong to a family, a group, a species that survives through cooperation. But somewhere along the way, for many of us, the lesson overcorrects. Belonging stops being one need among several and becomes the primary currency of safety. And so we build an internal room, a kind of constant audience chamber, where an imagined panel watches everything we do and issues silent verdicts. You walk into adulthood still carrying that room with you. Most people do. The panel changes faces. Parents become teachers, become bosses, become strangers online, become, eventually, everyone, all at once, all the time. But the architecture of the room stays exactly the same. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, the bitter, brilliant narrator of Notes from Underground, lives almost entirely inside a room like this. He is paralyzed by his awareness of how others might see him. He humiliates himself in advance, preemptively, so no one else can do it to him first. He is, in his own words on the page, a man of acute consciousness, hyper-aware, endlessly self-monitoring, and miserable precisely because of how much he watches himself being watched. Dostoevsky wasn't describing a villain, he was describing a mirror. Nearly everyone who reads that book recognizes some sliver of themselves in it, however uncomfortable that recognition is. Here is the composite story of a woman I'll call Anna. Anna was, by every external measure, successful. She ran a small design studio. She had good friends. And she also had a very specific, very private ritual. After almost any conversation of consequence, she would spend the next hour mentally relitigating it. Had she talked too much? Not enough? Had her opinion on the client's project sounded arrogant? Or worse, had it sounded weak? She didn't think of this as a problem. She thought of it as diligence, care, the cost of being a considerate person. It took her years to notice the actual cost. She had not offered a genuinely unfiltered opinion to another human being in longer than she could remember. Every sentence that left her mouth had already been pre-approved by the silent panel in the room she never left. This is the first stage. Not people-pleasing as an occasional habit, but as an entire operating system, one installed so early and so completely that it feels simply like personality, like you. It's worth pausing here, because this is the part most people skip past too quickly, eager to get to the solution. The solution isn't available yet, not because you're not ready for it, but because you haven't fully looked at what you're solving. So look at it plainly, for a moment, without flinching away. Notice how many decisions in your week are actually two decisions happening at once, the real one and the shadow one running just behind it, calculating how the real one will be received. What to wear, what to say when someone asks how you're doing, whether to bring up the thing that's actually bothering you, or the smaller, safer thing instead. Whether to laugh at a joke that didn't land, purely because the silence of not laughing felt more dangerous than the dishonesty of laughing. None of this makes you unusual. It makes you someone who was, at some point, taught, not necessarily cruelly, sometimes even lovingly, that your acceptability was conditional. That love, attention, safety, all of it had to be earned through correct behavior, correct emotion, correct presentation. Once that lesson lands early enough, it doesn't feel like a lesson anymore. It feels like the truth about how the world works. Dostoevsky, more than almost any writer before or since, understood how early wounds calcify into permanent philosophies. His characters are rarely villains in any simple sense. They're people whose early deprivations of love, of dignity, of being truly seen, hardened into worldviews that then governed everything they did as adults. usually without their awareness. The underground man doesn't know he's still reacting to old humiliations. He believes he has simply arrived, through pure intellect, at the correct and bitter conclusion that people are cruel and connection is a trap. He mistakes an old wound for a philosophy. This is worth sitting with, because it may be true of you too, in a gentler form. The part of you that pre-edits every sentence for acceptability isn't a philosophy either. It's a wound wearing the costume of good judgment. And here is the strange comfort in that, if it's a wound, it can heal. If it was simply who you are, you'd be stuck with it. It isn't. It's a room you built, brick by brick, out of necessity. At a time when you had far fewer resources and far less power than you have now. You built it to survive something. It did its job. It kept you safe enough, loved enough, accepted enough to make it to this point in your life. But you're not in that room anymore. Or rather, you are, but only because no one has told your nervous system it's safe to leave. The walls are still standing, not because they're load-bearing, but because nobody has tested whether they still need to be there. The reason this matters before we go further is this. You cannot dismantle a room you don't know you're standing in. Most people spend their whole lives rearranging the furniture, new jobs, new relationships, new cities, convinced that changing the scenery will change the watching. It won't. The panel comes with you. It's not made of other people. It's made of you. Chapter 2. The performance that feels like peace once the room is built. Most people don't experience it as suffering, at least not consciously. They experience it as smoothness. Things go well. People like them. Conflict is rare, because conflict is almost always avoided 3 steps before it could ever begin. This is the false coping mechanism, and it's worth naming precisely, not people-pleasing as weakness, but people-pleasing as control. If you can predict what will make others comfortable and deliver it flawlessly, you never have to risk the terror of their disapproval. You've essentially pre-negotiated the outcome of every interaction before it starts. Dostoevsky was fascinated by this kind of controlled performance, the mask so well fitted it starts to feel like the face underneath. In The Brothers Karamazov, he gives us the story the Grand Inquisitor tells, a vision of humanity so exhausted by the burden of real freedom. The freedom to choose, to be wrong, to be judged for choosing, that people will trade it away gladly for comfort, certainty, and someone else's approval of how they should live. Given the choice between freedom and bread, the Inquisitor argues, almost everyone will choose bread. Approval is a kind of bread. It's warm, it's immediate. It asks nothing of you except that you keep performing for it. This is where modern psychology quietly agrees with a 19th century novelist. Shame researchers describe something very close to this, a chronic hypervigilance to others' judgment that functions, paradoxically, as a safety strategy, the nervous system's attempt to prevent the pain of rejection by controlling for it in advance. It's not vanity, it's armor, and like most armor, it's exhausting to wear, and it does eventually start to weigh more than the blow it was built to prevent. The performance works, for a while. That's the trap of it. It works well enough, for long enough, that most people never question it until something forces the question. Think about how efficient this system actually is, once it's fully installed. You develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to the emotional temperature of a room. You can sense a shift in someone's mood before they've said a word about it. You become, in a very real sense, excellent at other people, attuned, responsive, generous with your attention. Friends describe you as easy to talk to. Colleagues describe you as low maintenance, easygoing, a pleasure to work with. These are not false compliments. They are accurate descriptions of a very real skill. The trouble is what the skill costs, and where the bill for it eventually comes due. Because a self that is endlessly responsive to everyone else's emotional weather rarely gets the chance to develop its own. You get so good at reading the room that you forget to check in with the only person in the room whose reading actually determines how you'll feel afterward. Yourself, Ask a person deep in this pattern what they want, cleanly, without triangulating it through what would be reasonable to want, what wouldn't be selfish to want, what others would think of them for wanting it. And you'll often get a long pause, not because they're indecisive, because the question requires accessing a part of themselves that has been, for years, politely and continuously overridden. Dostoevsky wrote about this kind of self-erasure with startling precision in the character of Sonia in Crime and Punishment, though her circumstances were far more desperate than most readers. Sonia gives herself away, piece by piece, in service of others, to the point where she nearly disappears from her own story as an independent will. And yet, Dostoevsky never treats her generosity as pathology exactly. He treats it as a question left open. What happens to a person who has given so much of themselves to others' needs that they've lost track of their own? Is that saintliness, or is it a slower kind of vanishing? The novel doesn't answer this simply, and neither should we. Generosity and self-erasure can look identical from the outside. The difference is internal, whether the giving comes from a full well or an empty one performing fullness, because emptiness isn't allowed to be seen. This is where modern psychology quietly agrees with a 19th century novelist. Shame researchers describe something very close to this, a chronic hypervigilance to others' judgment that functions, paradoxically, as a safety strategy, the nervous system's attempt to prevent the pain of rejection by controlling for it in advance. It's not vanity. It's armor, and like most armor, it's exhausting to wear, and it does eventually start to weigh more than the blow it was built to prevent. You may notice, if you're honest, a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't map onto physical exhaustion. A social hangover after gatherings that should have been enjoyable. A vague, low dread on Sunday evenings that isn't really about the coming work week so much as the accumulated cost of another week spent performing agreeableness. This tiredness is data. It's telling you something the polite surface of your life has been quietly overriding for a long time. You may already know what the thing that finally forces the question usually is. It's rarely a single dramatic event. More often it's an accumulation, years of a voice inside you getting quieter and quieter, saying less and less, until one day you notice you don't actually know what you think about your own life anymore. You know what you're supposed to think. You know what would be well received. But the original, unperformed opinion, you have to search for it now. Like something buried. That search is not a failure. It's the beginning of the next stage. Chapter 3. The cost you stop noticing here is where the pattern starts to fray. Though rarely all at once. Small cracks appear. You say yes to something you didn't want to do, and instead of the usual mild resignation, you feel something sharper. A flash of resentment that surprises you with its intensity. You watch someone else say an unpopular thing in a meeting and survive it, completely unscathed, and you feel something like grief. Not for them. For the years you spent assuming that survival was impossible for you. Dostoevsky understood this fraying intimately because he wrote his characters into it again and again. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, spends most of the novel performing composure, while an internal reality tears itself apart beneath the surface. He believes, for a long time, that he can manage the gap between what he shows the world and what he actually is. The novel's entire tension comes from watching that gap become unmanageable. You don't need to have committed Raskolnikov's crime to recognize his exhaustion. The gap between the performed self and the real self, held open long enough, becomes its own kind of suffering, quieter, slower, but corrosive in the same way. Here is the composite story of a man I'll call Dmitri. Dmitri had spent 15 years as the reliable one, the colleague who never pushed back, the friend who always accommodated the group's plans, the son who called his parents every Sunday and never once told them how much those calls drained him. One Sunday, mid-call, his mother made an offhand comment about a decision he'd made. A mild criticism, nothing cruel. the kind of thing she'd said 100 times before, and Dmitri found himself, to his own genuine shock, saying, "I don't actually want to talk about that." 6 words. He hung up afterward and sat in a kind of stunned silence, waiting for the ceiling to come down. It didn't. His mother called back an hour later, slightly wounded, mildly confused, and the relationship, remarkably, survived, not just survived. Within a few months, it was more honest than it had been in a decade. But that's not the part of the story that matters most. What matters is what Dmitri said afterward, describing the moment to a friend. "I don't think I said it because I'd built up courage. I think I said it because I was too tired not to." This is the third stage. And it's important to name honestly, the beginning of change rarely looks like strength. It looks like depletion. The performance doesn't stop because you finally became brave. It stops because you ran out of the energy required to keep it running. There's a particular kind of relief that follows moments like Dmitri's, and it's worth describing precisely because it doesn't look like the relief people expect. It isn't triumphant. It's closer to the ache after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd stopped registering the weight. An ache in muscles you didn't know were straining until the strain stopped. You might notice this in smaller versions before it arrives in a larger one. A slight impatience with your own apologies, catching yourself saying sorry for something that required no apology, and feeling for the first time a flicker of irritation at your own reflex rather than comfort in it. A moment of scrolling past a message you'd normally respond to instantly and choosing, almost experimentally, to let it sit for an hour. Small tests. Small withdrawals of the constant offering. Dostoevsky understood that change rarely announces itself with resolve. It arrives, more often, through depletion, through the body and the psyche simply refusing to keep funding a project that costs more than it returns. His character, Raskolnikov, doesn't confess to his crime because he becomes virtuous. He confesses because the weight of concealment becomes physically, psychologically unbearable, because maintaining the gap between his performed innocence and his actual guilt requires more from him than he has left to give. You are not confessing to a crime, but you may be carrying something structurally similar, a gap between the self you present and the self underneath it, held open for so long that maintaining it has become its own quiet form of suffering. The good news, if there is good news in this stage, is that gaps like this cannot be held open forever. Something in you is already working, mostly without your conscious permission, to close it. This closing rarely happens gently. It tends to happen in exactly the moment you least expect. An offhand comment on a Sunday phone call, a look on someone's face that you suddenly can't perform your way around, a night where you're simply too tired to say the agreeable thing one more time. These moments feel, in the instant they're happening, like failures of composure. They are not failures. They are the first honest transactions you've made with another person in longer than you realized. Dostoevsky would not have called this weakness. He would have called it the first honest moment in a long time. Confession, in his moral universe, is never a graceful act. It is what happens when a person can no longer sustain the lie, and the collapse of the lie, however messy, is the doorway to something real. Notice, too, what tends to happen in the aftermath of these small, honest moments. The ones that don't destroy anything, that the relationship survives, sometimes even strengthens. This is important data, and it's easy to let it slide past unexamined because the relief of survival crowds out the lesson. The lesson is this: the catastrophe you'd spent years protecting against by maintaining the performance was, more often than not, imagined, not entirely. Sometimes honesty does cost something real. Some relationships genuinely cannot bear it, but far less often than the fear predicted. The nervous system, once it collects enough evidence of survival, slowly begins to recalibrate. This recalibration is the actual mechanism of the whole journey, not willpower, not a single dramatic insight, just repeated, lived evidence that the sky, in fact, does not fall. Chapter 4. The isolation that looks like independence there is a dangerous detour on this road, and most people who are waking up to their people-pleasing walk straight into it. Having noticed the cost of constant accommodation, the instinct is often to swing hard in the opposite direction, to stop caring deliberately by force, to announce, sometimes literally, that you no longer care what anyone thinks, and to treat that announcement as the finish line. This isn't the finish line, it's a detour that can look, from the outside and even from the inside, remarkably similar to freedom. But it isn't freedom, it's a different, colder version of the same fear. Real indifference to others' opinions doesn't need to be declared. It doesn't perform itself loudly in rooms as a way of proving something. What often gets called not caring what people think at this stage is actually a kind of preemptive rejection, pushing people away before they can judge you. Walling off connections so thoroughly that judgment simply has no root in. It solves the original problem the way amputation solves a broken bone. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, again, is the clearest portrait of this. He convinces himself he's superior to the people whose approval he craves. He mocks the very connection he's starving for. He isolates himself and calls it philosophy. But the isolation isn't peace. It's the same wound wearing a new, angrier mask. You may recognize a milder version of this in yourself. The urge, after finally speaking an honest opinion, to overcorrect into harshness. To prove your new honesty by being unnecessarily blunt, as if kindness itself were evidence of the old performance. To interpret every boundary as needing to be an act of coldness rather than an act of clarity. This is worth sitting with, because it's the part of the journey most people misdiagnose as the destination. If you find yourself feeling proud of not caring, feeling a kind of triumphant contempt for people who still do, that pride is often a signal you haven't arrived yet. You've simply relocated the audience from everyone to everyone who represents my old fear, and you're still performing for them, just in reverse. Real freedom from the opinions of others doesn't need an audience to prove itself to, not even an audience of your former self. There's a quieter version of this detour worth naming too, because it's easier to miss than the loud, declarative kind. It doesn't announce itself as "I don't care what people think." It shows up instead as a gradual narrowing, fewer people let close, fewer opinions shared even with those who are close, a slow retreat into a smaller and smaller circle where the risk of judgment feels manageable because the audience has been reduced to almost nothing. This can look, from a distance, like self-sufficiency. Sometimes people even admire it, the friend who doesn't need anyone, the colleague who seems entirely unbothered by office politics because they've simply stopped participating in office life altogether. But there's a difference between someone who has made genuine peace with solitude and someone who has fled into it because connection itself became too dangerous to risk. Dostoevsky drew this distinction sharply if you look closely at how his most isolated characters are written. The underground man isn't peaceful in his isolation, he's tormented by it, circling obsessively around the very people he claims to have transcended, unable to stop thinking about how they perceive him even from the safety of his self-imposed exile. His isolation isn't freedom from the audience, it's a more elaborate performance for that same audience, staged entirely inside his own head, where he gets to write and rewrite their reactions without any of them actually present to complicate the fantasy. This is worth checking honestly in yourself. When you imagine not caring what people think, what does the fantasy actually contain? If it involves cutting people off, proving a point, being vindicated in some imagined future confrontation, that's not the destination. That's still the old room, just rearranged, with you now cast as the defiant hero instead of the anxious performer. The panel is still watching. You've simply changed your costume for it. The actual destination doesn't require an audience at all, not even a hostile one, not even an admiring one. It doesn't need to be witnessed to feel true. This is, in fact, one of the more reliable tests for whether you've reached it. Does the freedom you feel require anyone else to notice it, validate it, or be impressed by it? If it does, you're still performing. You've just switched which performance you're giving. Chapter 5. The night the performance breaks there is usually a specific moment, not a gradual fading, but a distinct, often unwelcome event, where the entire architecture built in Chapter 1 finally gives way. It doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes it's a diagnosis, a divorce, a public failure, a private one. Sometimes it's something as small as saying no to the wrong person at the wrong time and discovering, in the silence that follows, that the sky does not fall, and somehow that discovery undoes something load-bearing in you. Whatever the trigger, the internal experience tends to share a common shape: the sudden, vertiginous realization that the panel in the room, the one you've been performing for since childhood, was never actually watching as closely as you believed. That much of your suffering was not a response to real judgment, but to an imagined judgment you had been rehearsing, alone, for years. This is not a comfortable realization. It can feel, at first, less like liberation and more like grief. Grief for the version of your life spent editing yourself into smallness for an audience that, in many cases, was barely paying attention. Grief for the honest things unsaid, the real opinions unshared, the years spent performing safety instead of living. Dostoevsky knew this particular grief personally. Standing before that firing squad as a young man, blindfolded, listening to the drums, believing with total certainty that he had minutes left to live, he described afterward how radically his sense of what mattered rearranged itself in that final stretch of time. The pettiness of status, reputation, other people's opinions, all of it evaporated almost instantly against the fact of his own imminent death. When the reprieve came, and it came at the very last second, he did not return to his old life unchanged. He returned understanding, with a clarity most people never have to earn so violently, how much of ordinary human suffering is spent worrying about things that would mean nothing on the edge of that scaffold. You do not need a firing squad to reach this understanding, but you may need something that feels, internally, almost as absolute. A moment where the old performance simply cannot continue, where the cost of keeping it running finally, unmistakably, exceeds the cost of letting it collapse. This is the turning point, and it's worth being honest about its texture. It rarely feels like victory in the moment. It feels like falling. Like the floor you'd built your whole identity on turning out to be far less solid than you thought. But here is what almost no one tells you about this particular kind of falling. It is not falling away from yourself. It is falling toward yourself, for what may be the first time in years. The ground that gives way was never actually you. It was the performance. And performances, however long-standing, are not load-bearing. What's underneath them is. It's worth staying with this moment a little longer, because it deserves more than a quick pass-through on the way to resolution. This is, after all, the emotional center of everything we've been building toward. Picture it concretely. Picture the version of this night that might already be somewhere in your near future, or might already have happened, unrecognized, in your recent past. You say the thing you've never said. You stop performing the calm you don't feel. You let someone see the actual cost of what you've been carrying, instead of the smoothed-over version you usually offer. And in the silence that follows, because there is almost always a silence, a beat where nothing has been decided yet, you feel something close to terror, not metaphorical terror, the real, physical kind. Heart rate up, breath shallow. A voice inside insisting this was a catastrophic mistake, that you should take it back, soften it, apologize, restore the old smoothness immediately before any real damage is done. This is the exact moment the entire pattern was built to prevent. And this is also precisely the moment that has to be lived through rather than avoided. Because avoiding it is what kept the pattern alive for however many years it's been running. Dostoevsky wrote toward this exact threshold obsessively across nearly every major work. His characters rarely change through gentle realization. They change through a night, a scene, a moment of exposure they cannot take back. Raskolnikov's confession. The Grand Inquisitor's silent kiss from the Christ he's imprisoned. Dmitry Karamazov's arrest for a crime he didn't commit, forcing a reckoning with the man he actually is beneath the one he'd been performing. Dostoevsky did not believe people changed by deciding to. He believed people changed when reality finally became too loud to keep managing through performance. And something in them broke open rather than bent. This breaking open is not the same as breaking down, though in the moment it can feel indistinguishable. Breaking down is collapse without direction, an ending with nothing on the other side. Breaking open is collapse that clears space, the same physical sensation, the same vertigo, but oriented towards something rather than simply toward nothing. You will likely not know, in the moment itself, which one it is. That uncertainty is part of what makes this stage so disorienting and so easy to retreat from. The instinct to rush back to the old performance, to apologize your way back into the old safety, will be strong precisely because the old safety, however costly, was at least familiar. The new openness is not familiar yet. It hasn't earned your nervous system's trust. That trust only comes after, sometimes long after, through the accumulation of evidence that this kind of exposure, however terrifying, does not actually destroy you. So if you find yourself in this moment, or recognize that you already have been in it recently, here is the only guidance worth offering. Don't rush to explain it away. Let the silence after the honest thing sit for longer than feels bearable. Let the other person's reaction, whatever it turns out to be, arrive on its own time, instead of trying to manage or predict or soften it in advance. You have spent years managing other people's reactions before they happen. This is the first time you're being asked to simply let a reaction be what it is, without controlling it. That letting go is the turning point, not the honest thing you said, the willingness to not immediately take it back. Chapter 6. What actually waits on the other side here is the specific thing promised at the start of this video, the texture of what comes after the collapse, the part almost no one describes accurately. It is not indifference. Indifference is cold, and this isn't cold. It is not confidence, exactly, if by confidence you mean a loud certainty that drowns out doubt. This stage is quieter than that, and stranger. The clearest way to describe it, you stop mentally rehearsing other people's reactions before they happen. Not because you've decided to stop. Willpower rarely sustains this kind of change, but because the rehearsal simply loses its grip, the way a habit loses its grip once its underlying fear has been faced and found survivable. You say the true thing in the meeting, and there's a beat of exposure, there always is, that doesn't fully disappear, but it passes through you now, instead of lodging in you. You feel someone's disapproval, and it registers as information rather than verdict. You notice, with something like quiet astonishment, that you can disagree with someone you love, and the disagreement doesn't threaten the love. It just sits there, honestly, alongside it. Dostoevsky's later work, especially through characters like Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov, gestures toward this state. Not a man who has stopped feeling, not a man immune to others' pain or opinion, but a man whose sense of his own worth no longer depends on winning every verdict. Alyosha can be doubted, mocked, misunderstood, and it does not unmake him, because what makes him was never in other people's hands to begin with. This is close to what attachment theory, in its own modern language, calls earned security, the discovery that a person's sense of safety and worth can be built and rebuilt from the inside, even after it was shaped, originally, by outside forces that didn't provide it reliably. It doesn't erase the old wiring, It builds new wiring alongside it, strong enough to hold weight the old wiring couldn't. The strange gift hidden inside this stage is this: you become, almost accidentally, more likable, not because you're trying to be, but because people can feel the difference between someone performing warmth for approval and someone offering it freely, with nothing riding on whether it's received well. Freedom from the need to be liked tends, paradoxically, to make a person easier to actually love. There's a particular, small texture to this stage worth describing precisely, because it's easy to miss if you're expecting something more dramatic. It shows up in ordinary moments. Someone disagrees with you in a group setting, and instead of the old flood, the racing heart, the need to immediately defend or retreat or over-explain, there's just a pause, a genuine considering of what they said. Maybe you agree with part of it. Maybe you don't, and you say so plainly, without the apology that used to precede every disagreement like a tax paid in advance. You notice, too, a new relationship to silence. The old pattern couldn't tolerate a silence after you'd spoken. It needed to fill it, soften it, check it for signs of disapproval. In this later stage, silence becomes just silence. Sometimes it means someone's thinking. Sometimes it means nothing at all. You no longer treat every pause as a verdict waiting to be delivered. This doesn't mean you stop caring about how you affect people. If anything, the caring becomes more precise, because it's no longer diluted by anxiety. You can tell the difference now between causing someone genuine harm, which still matters to you, deeply, and simply causing someone mild disappointment because you had a boundary or an honest opinion they didn't love. The old pattern treated both of these as equally catastrophic. This later stage can finally tell them apart. Dostoevsky's later work, especially through characters like Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov, gestures toward this state. Not a man who has stopped feeling. Not a man immune to others' pain or opinion, but a man whose sense of his own worth no longer depends on winning every verdict. Alyosha can be doubted, mocked, misunderstood, and it does not unmake him, because what makes him was never in other people's hands to begin with. Notice, too, that Alyosha isn't withdrawn or aloof. He's the most relationally present character in the entire novel, moving towards suffering rather than away from it, able to sit with his brother's worst moments without needing to fix, perform, or flee. His security doesn't make him distant. It makes him capable of real closeness, because closeness no longer threatens him the way it once might have. This is close to what attachment theory, in its own modern language, calls earned security, the discovery that a person's sense of safety and worth can be built and rebuilt from the inside, even after it was shaped, originally, by outside forces that didn't provide it reliably. It doesn't erase the old wiring, it builds new wiring alongside it, strong enough to hold weight the old wiring couldn't. The strange gift hidden inside this stage is this: you become, almost accidentally, more likable, not because you're trying to be, but because people can feel the difference between someone performing warmth for approval and someone offering it freely, with nothing riding on whether it's received well. Freedom from the need to be liked tends, paradoxically, to make a person easier to actually love. This is not the end of caring what people think. You will still care. You are still human, still built for connection, still capable of being stung by unkindness. Dostoevsky never wrote a character who transcended feeling. He distrusted that kind of claim, in himself and in others. He was suspicious of anyone who claimed to have risen entirely above ordinary human need, treating that claim itself as a kind of pride, a subtler and more dangerous performance than the one it replaced. What changes is not the presence of caring, it's the weight of it. It stops being the foundation your entire identity rests on, and becomes, instead, one true and manageable feeling among many. You will have bad days inside this stage too. Days where an old comment resurfaces and stings more than it should. Days where you catch yourself, briefly, back in the rehearsal, pre-editing a sentence before it leaves your mouth. This doesn't mean you've lost the ground you gained. Growth like this isn't a line, it's closer to a spiral, circling back through familiar territory but from a slightly higher vantage each time. The old room doesn't vanish completely, it just stops being the only room you live in. Hashtag resolution and integration. There's no clean, triumphant ending to this, and if this video promised you one, it would be lying to you the same way the old performance did. What waits for you if you walk this whole way through is not a version of yourself who no longer feels exposed. It's a version who has felt exposed, fully, and found out that exposure does not end you. That knowledge doesn't arrive as a revelation you can borrow secondhand from a video. It has to be lived. Somewhere ahead of you. Maybe soon. Maybe already underway. There will be a moment where the performance you've maintained for years simply cannot hold anymore. It may come as a conversation you can't avoid, a boundary you finally state out loud, a truth you stop editing before it leaves your mouth. It will likely not feel brave while it's happening. It will probably feel like failure, like falling, like something breaking that you spent your whole life trying to keep intact. Let it break. Not violently. Not as a performance of its own, the way the false independence in Chapter 4 mistakes coldness for freedom. Just honestly. Let the old room, the one with the silent panel in it, go quiet. Not because you shouted it down, but because you finally stopped needing its verdict to know you were real. Dostoevsky spent his life circling one central conviction, through every ruined and redeemed character he ever wrote, that human dignity is not something granted by an audience. It survives humiliation. It survives failure, exile, poverty, the worst things other people can think of you. It was never theirs to give in the first place, which means it was never theirs to take away. You will still care what people think sometimes. That's not the failure state. That's just being alive among other people, wired for connection the way every human is. The difference, when this stage finally arrives, is that the caring will sit lightly. It will visit and pass through, instead of moving in and redecorating the whole house. You are allowed to still be in the middle of this. Most people are. The exhaustion you feel from all that monitoring, all that pre-editing, all that silent negotiation with an audience half imagined, that exhaustion is not a sign you're failing at being at peace. It's the sound of the old architecture straining, finally, under its own unsustainable weight. It's worth saying plainly what this journey does not require, because the absence of these things is often mistaken for the absence of progress. It does not require you to become someone who enjoys conflict. It does not require you to stop feeling nervous before a hard conversation, or to stop caring at some level whether the people you love are proud of you. It does not require you to burn down every relationship built on the old performance, as if honesty could only prove itself through demolition. Some of those relationships will hold. Some will need renegotiating. A few, possibly, will not survive contact with the truer version of you, and that too is not a failure. It's simply information about what those relationships were actually built on. Dostoevsky was never interested in easy transformations, and this video shouldn't pretend to offer one either. His characters who find something like peace, Raskolnikov in the novel's quiet epilogue, working toward a slow redemption in Siberian exile rather than a dramatic one. Alyosha, carrying both grief and faith at once without either cancelling the other out, arrive there through years, not moments. The moment of collapse we spent Chapter 5 inside is real and necessary, but it is a beginning, not an ending. What follows it is slower, less cinematic, and in its own way more demanding, the daily practice of staying honest once the old performance has stopped being available to you. There will be days, especially early on, where the old room feels like it's calling you back, where the safety of pre-editing yourself into acceptability looks, briefly, more appealing than the exposure of being fully seen. This is not a sign you've failed. It's a sign you're human, navigating a genuinely difficult transition without a map, because no one gave you one earlier in life when the original architecture was being built. What you have now, that you may not have had before, is a name for what's happening. A frame that isn't shame. I'm doing this wrong. I should be over this by now. But something closer to recognition. This is the stage. This is what it feels like from inside it. I am not behind. I am in it. That reframe alone will not finish the work, but it changes what the work feels like while you're doing it. It's the difference between wandering lost in a forest with no sense of whether you're making progress and walking a difficult trail you at least know has an end. Walked before by people whose accounts you can trust, even if the specific path in front of you is still yours alone to walk. You are allowed to still be in the middle of this. Most people are. The exhaustion you feel from all that monitoring, all that pre-editing, all that silent negotiation with an audience half imagined, that exhaustion is not a sign you're failing at being at peace. It's the sound of the old architecture straining, finally, under its own unsustainable weight. That straining is not the end of you. It's the very beginning of the version of you that doesn't need to flinch. If this video found you somewhere in the middle of that straining, tired of editing yourself, tired of the rehearsal, tired of a room full of people who were, most of the time, barely watching, you're not behind. You're closer to the end of it than the exhaustion wants you to believe. If some part of this sat with you the way it was meant to, consider staying a little longer with these ideas. Subscribe, or send this to someone else who's quietly carrying the same weight. Not because it will fix anything overnight, but because some things are easier to walk through when you know someone else is walking through something similar close by. There is a final stage before you stop caring what people think. You are already, quietly, on your way there.